Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready Steady Play. And today we've got a bit of an undertaking for you, because what I'm going to do is talk you through the setup and rules for Joan of Arc, A Time of Legends Joan of Arc. If you're unfamiliar with Joan of Arc, it's a miniatures historical war game that out of this box offers a number of historical scenarios. We looked through it. I think we calculated about 10 of the 12 were pretty much totally historical. And then the other 2 were mythological or supernatural in some way. Because after what you've got is all of this other stuff for the game that branches into the supernatural, the theological, the mythological, so you can start incorporating mythical beasts into your games, you can start incorporating mythical creatures, and also theological creatures like angels and demons as well. But if you want to keep it true to the 100 Years' War and the historical events, you can do that as well. So the game has a real sort of scope to it, and you can decide what is right for you. It says on the box that it takes 45 to 90 minutes to play. I guess that depends on the scenario you pick, but I would venture that it probably takes a bit longer than that. That also probably doesn't factor in setup time, which can take quite a while. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through the basic rules that you're going to use in practically every scenario. There's a lot of scenario-specific rules that I won't cover in this video, because they'll only be pertinent to the particular scenario you're playing. But what I will do in this video is give you the basic rundown on turn structure, movement, attacking, all that kind of good stuff. So I'll also go into a bit of detail on some advanced rules as well at the end of the video. So if you really want to know what we're going to cover in detail, check out the sections below. I always include those in the video so you know what's going on and you can have some idea on what we're going to be covering, and also find something specific if you're looking for it. Normally what I do is a comprehensive component rundown, but I think by the time I went through all the components for Joan of Arc, what I'm not going to cover is every unit and every miniature, because there's just no time in this video. But what I will do is show you all the stuff that you'll use in every scenario in order to set up any given scenario. I hope you're excited to come on this Time of Legends Joan of Arc journey with us. Of course, I'll be back for gameplay tomorrow. But in the meantime, let's get started. So we're going to start with a quick components rundown of some of the fundamental stuff in the box. So the first component you'll need for any game is a selection of miniatures, and the miniatures you use will be based entirely on the scenario and the units used by the armies present in that scenario. What I've got here is just a selection of the miniatures that you'll be using in the game. So in Joan of Arc you'll have lots of different terrain elements like this house and this tree, which will be set up on the board and used to indicate the terrain elements. You might have theological monsters like this angel here on a medium-sized base, or this special character here, who's a civilian executioner character on a base like that. Here we've got a cavalry unit. Typical cavalry unit has 2 models on a base like that. Here we've got some sergeant at arms. This is a typical infantry unit. 3 models on a largish base like that. And then we've got characters as well, and characters are sort of representing the heroes in the army, running around on their own, getting up to heroic deeds and commanding the infantry and stuff like that. Of course, in the core set, you've got a rule book that's going to help you figure out what's going on, and this scenario book as well, which has all the scenarios that you might play in the game, and it's got all the map layouts and armies and stuff in it, so you'll definitely need this book to reference for your games. We've got some of these player aids as well, double-sided with lots of information about the game. These are really useful, so you'll want to make sure each player has one of these. You will have a ton of different kinds of terrain tiles of varying sizes as well. And these will be divided up into hexes and areas, and they're double-sided, so you've got lots of variety there. But you will have a varying amount of these based on how many of the expansions and things you've got. But all of them are handily numbered so that you can easily find the ones you need on the correct side to set up the particular scenario that you're playing. There are lots of dice in Joan of Arc. So we'll need lots and lots of these dice for resolving conflicts. But you should see we've got red dice, black dice, yellow dice, white dice. We've got these big purple gigantic monster dice, and we've got 1 beige fate die. You will have 4 different kinds of order flags in 4 different colors. If you do not have the Kickstarter or the plunder box that comes with the Kickstarter, you will just have wooden cubes matching these colors instead. There's a gray activation, a green charge, a brown reactivation, and a blue interrupt. You will have 4 player boards. You will have 1 battle board. You will have 3 currencies, which include XP points, legendary points, and intrigue points. You will have fire markers, reroll tokens, building damage tokens, and character wound tokens as well. You will have a lot of these scenario-specific tokens. You will have building interior tiles, barricade tokens, a first player marker, rally point markers for the different factions, and an assortment of other scenario and skill specific tokens. You will have an assortment of plastic bases to put on the miniatures in 4 different colors. You will have a bunch of large hero cards. You will have some small civilian cards and small unit cards. There'll be a bunch of them. You'll have a deck of round cards, a deck of War Council cards, a deck of Mythic Legendary cards, a deck of Tactical Legendary cards. Don't mix these 2 decks together, they should be separate. A deck of Blue Gemstone Equipment cards, a deck of Yellow Gemstone Equipment cards, and a deck of very scenario-specific Werewolf cards. You'll have a deck of Intrigue cards, and a deck of Discussion cards as well. So now I'm going to show you the setup, and because each scenario is incredibly specific, I'm not going to go through how to set up everything, but what I will show you are the basics, which means I'm going to show you how to set up the battle board, and I'll talk you through when something is scenario specific and when it's just general. I'm going to talk you through the player boards in the sort of player section, and then I'll talk you through just the other general bits and pieces. So this should prepare you nicely for setting up your own scenario, but you'll have to follow the guidelines of that scenario very specifically. So the first thing we're going to set up is this battle board. And the battle board is a bit like a generic dashboard that controls the general elements of the game. So the first thing we're going to put out are some round cards. And there's a whole lot of different round cards. The scenario will tell you how many to take out, and it will be based on the number of rounds in the scenario. Once you've selected the scenario-specific round cards, you'll put them out here. Next, we'll use the War Council deck, and we'll put out the entire deck, which is used for every scenario. We'll also put out the Fate die here. Now that we've set up our battle board, we'll put out one of our legendary decks. The scenario will call for one of the legendary decks specifically, either the green tactical deck or the brown mythic deck. So put out the appropriate deck and just give it a little shuffle. The scenario will tell you which hexes to put out and their placement. Because we're not playing a specific scenario, I'll just put some tiles in the middle of the table to represent that. The scenario will also instruct you when to put out trees in the forests and whether or not there are any buildings on the board. You will also need the interior building tiles as well, which are specific to the building models. Next, you're going to need your armies. Now, the game will detail exactly which units, characters, and perhaps civilians or other elements you have in each army. It will also tell you exactly where on the board those elements are deployed. Because we're not playing a specific scenario, I'll just show you very quickly some small examples. So here I've put out Joan of Arc and 2 units of halberdiers. Joan of Arc is a French hero. We know she's French because of this symbol here. More on card anatomy when we get to the rules section. We've got 3 Joan of Arc cards, and the scenario will tell us which one to use for this scenario. It's worth noting that this little gold symbol down here is an upgrade symbol, so you may need multiple Joan of Arc cards unless the scenario specifies that you don't, and we'll talk more about upgrading characters later on. The scenario will then tell you where Joan of Arc starts on the board. We've also got a unit of halberdiers. You'll notice they don't have the faction icon, which means they can be part of any army. The scenario will tell us which army these units of halberdiers are in. However, if both sides have halberdiers, then it's worth using different sculpts, because both of these units are halberdiers, they're just different sculpts. You can see these guys here at the front and these guys here at the back. And it's also helpful to differentiate by giving the French ones a blue base and the English ones a red base. The scenario will then tell you where these halberdiers start. There should be enough of these little unit cards so that every player can have one unit card for their units. But I advise you to take a good look at the scenario setup, because some unit cards have very small but subtle differences, and you'll need to make sure you have the correct cards laid out during this part of the setup. Each faction will have at least one rally point set up on the board as well. Players will each need a player board. The player board is used for holding your resources and things like that. Once you've got a player board, you will also get your player-specific stuff. Each player usually starts with one reroll token. You may also start with some currency available in the game, or some of the orders available in the game. Any orders you do start with, just start in the appropriate area on your player board, and any currency goes to the appropriate area as well. Finally, find any appropriate intrigue cards for your specific scenario and give them to the appropriate faction that they belong to. You can put out the 2 equipment decks. The scenario might include a number of civilians, so put out their civilian cards. If any of the civilian cards have this talk icon up here in the top right, then you'll need to find their discussion cards as well. There will be 4 level 1 discussion cards, which we know from the star, and there may also be some level 2 discussion cards as well. And don't forget to put out any civilian miniatures as well. The scenario will tell you where on the board the civilians begin. You'll note that some civilians might start independently on the board belonging to no army, while other civilians may start belonging to a specific faction, and so they will start with that civilian card. More on how civilians work when we get to the rules section, specifically in the Recruit a Civilian bonus action. You'll want to put your order flags, or cubes, and any general tokens and resource tokens in communal pools so that every player can access them. You will also have to give one player the first player marker so that we know who goes first. This will be defined by the scenario, and the first player will be the first player for the entire game. Once you've set up all of that stuff, you should be good to start playing the game. The scenario might have some other scenario-specific setup rules, such as scenario tokens or other decks of cards, but those will be clearly laid out in the scenario instructions. So let's move on to the rules of the game, where the majority of this video will take place. So, as we know, Joan of Arc is a game of recreating historical battles, mythical battles, supernatural or theological battles as well. And that will all be dependent on the scenario you've chosen to play. I'd usually talk a bit about how you win the game at this point, but the victory conditions will be entirely dependent on the scenario you're playing. It will outline just exactly how you'll win and lose, and there aren't really any general win or loss conditions. So make sure you check your scenario to find out just how you're going to win or lose this game of Joan of Arc. What I can tell you is that there are 4 phases to each round, and we'll look at all 4 of these phases in more detail in a moment. The first phase is the council phase, in which we'll be revealing cards on the battle board over here, and this will sort of tell us how many actions we have to take this round and any bonuses we might get. And then we move into the first player's turn. A player's turn is divided into 2 phases. The order phase, in which they use their order flags to move units around the board and engage in combat. There are many things you can do with an order activation, and this is where the majority of the game will take place. So we'll look at that in a lot more detail in the coming rules section. The second part of a player's turn is the reserve phase, where they just reserve order flags to keep for later. After the first player's turn, it's the second player's turn. If you're playing a game with more than 2 players, just insert additional player turns after the second player's turn. So we'll have first player, second player, then maybe third player and fourth player. The scenario will specify which players go in which order and which faction they should control. And after that, we move into the camp phase, which is divided into 3 sections. First, the Resolve Casualties section, and we'll look at that in more detail in the combat section of this video. The second part is the fire damage, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail when we get to the camp phase section of this video. And finally, check win conditions. And in this part, you will check to see whether anyone has won or lost the game. So let's look at the council phase in a bit more detail. The council phase largely takes place on the battle board here, and begins with you revealing the top card of the round deck. There should be 1 card per round in the scenario, so you won't have the full deck, but it will tell you which cards to put in, and if there's a specific order to the cards as well. We reveal the card and then resolve it. In this case, we've got 3 basic order flags on the card. This means that each player will receive 3 basic orders to put onto their player board into the window area. Note that if you have the basic retail version, these will be wooden cubes. After you've resolved the round card, we're going to reveal 3 War Council cards into the river section of the board down here. If you draw any duplicates, just discard that card and draw a new one. Then each player will get to pick 1 card to resolve, starting with the first player. Players can both pick the same card if they want. Once each player has resolved a card, we'll move on. I won't go through what all the cards do in this video, and you can find an explanation of the cards in the rulebook. The final part of the council phase is pay upkeep. This is where you have to pay a price for every level 2 character you have. Remember how we looked at those 3 Joan of Arc cards? Well, you can upgrade the character by leveling them up. More on this when we get to the upgrade a character action in this rules explanation. So you can look up that section if you want to find it. But you must pay 1 XP for every character you have over level 1. And if you don't pay this price, which you don't have to, the character will be affected and may die. So make sure you check out that upgrade a character section. So then we have the first player's turn, which begins with the orders phase. Now the orders phase is when we spend these flags to do things with our units. And I'm going to go into that in a lot of detail because this is where the majority of the game takes place. But I'm going to do it after I've finished going through the turn structure in detail. So after the orders phase, we have the reserve phase, which is very quick and easy. If, once you're done moving all of your units and taking actions and things, you have any order flags left over, you can move them down to this reserve section at the bottom of your player board. Note that you can only do this if there are spaces available for those actions. At the beginning of a round, these actions will become available to you again. Any actions you don't have room for will have to be discarded back to the common pool. At the end of your turn, you will probably wind up with a bunch of areas with order flags in them. More on how these order flags come out and activate units later in the rules section of this video. But at the end of the reserve phase, after you've reserved your orders, you'll clean up any of your flags that remain on the board and return them to the common pool. After every player has had a turn in the order specified by the scenario, we move into the camp phase. And the first part of the camp phase is check casualties. This is where we'll check to see if models that have been removed from the board are dead for good or might come back. More on this in the combat section of the order section of this video. To find that, check the sections in the description. After we've checked for casualties, we'll move into the fire phase, where we're going to check for fire damage. Here we've got an example of a fire in a space with a size 1 terrain, some stakes, a wall, and a barricade. The fire will destroy all size 1 terrain in addition to barricades and stakes. It doesn't destroy the wall. Units suffer 1 red die worth of damage. When rolling for damage from fire, you cannot defend. We've rolled a disrupt symbol, so our halberdiers are removed from the board. For more on die results, check out the combat section of our video. If the fire is in a space with a building, then we check the size of the building. In this case it's 4, which means the building has 4 hit points. So we add a damage token to show the building is damaged. If the building receives 4 damage tokens, it's destroyed. So after you've resolved any fires on the map, it's time to check to see if anyone's won or lost the game. This check is specific to the scenario, so you'll just have to check those victory conditions and check the state of the game. So once you've completed the camp phase, you'll move back to the council phase. You'll reveal the next round card and another set of war council cards. People will pay upkeep and the game will continue. If you ever run out of round cards because the scenario told you to put out a specific amount, then the game will end and the scenario will tell you what happens. So now we're getting into the rules section in depth. And the very first thing we're going to cover is card anatomy. Here we've got a basic unit card. Because this unit doesn't have a faction, it can belong to any army. You've got the name of the card here. This art corresponds to the models that might be representing this unit. You see here we've got some guys that represent this person on the far left. And here we've got some halberdiers that represent the person on the far right. And the reason we have these distinct models is so that we can have multiple factions with halberdiers. What you've got here is a little symbol that indicates what kind of unit they are. In this case, this shows their infantry. Over here we've got their attack value, which is 1 white die. And over here their defense value, 1 red die and 1 white die. Any special rules they have are in the middle here. These are their key words. All of the keywords are explained in detail on the player aids as well as in the back of the rulebook. And we'll cover some of them in this video, including Retaliation, which we'll talk about in the attack action section of this rules breakdown. Then down here in the middle you've got any special rules that apply specifically to the unit. For example, in this case you can see that they have an extra white die for attacks against other infantry units. By contrast, the civilian cards have a faction up here to show that they're civilians. This is the civilian symbol. They've also got a little talk icon up here sometimes, although others do not. Civilians may or may not have attack and defense values, and may or may not have special rules in the middle as well. The other kind of card you'll see are these big character cards, and these represent the special characters in the game. They are typically faction specific, and have their faction up here in the top left. The name of the character is in the middle, and on the right here what you've got is a level marker. Now Joan of Arc is a very special character in that she's got a level 0 card, which is used for specific scenarios. Most of the characters begin at level 1, which is indicated by 1 star here, and typically have a level 2 variant as well, sometimes on the back of the card, and sometimes the level 2 card is separate because it's got 2 different sides to it. In this case we can see that Joan of Arc can upgrade to a holy or unholy variant when she goes up to level 2. The cost to upgrade a character is indicated here in the golden arrow. Again we've got the unit type here, their attack value and defense value, any keywords that give them special abilities or special actions they can take, as well as any special abilities down here in the card text. Characters will also typically have a wound value down here in the bottom left. This is the number of wounds they can take before they die. So Joan of Arc can take 2 wounds before she's killed. They will also typically have this command value down here. The command is a special action that characters can take, which we'll talk about in the character bonus actions section of this video. So now we're going to talk about hexes. And hexes on the board. You'll notice that we've got a bunch of different kinds of hexes here, and some of them are divided up into different areas, and some are not. So let's talk about that. So first we're going to talk about some basic vernacular. A hex is 1 space like this, or like this. These are sometimes divided up into areas. Here we have 3, here we've got 1. These areas have a capacity, which is the amount they can hold. Units can only move into an area if it's got capacity to hold them. So let's talk about the capacity of these different areas. So as you can see here, we've got a hex divided up into 3 different areas. And it's worth noting that these 3 areas are divided into different terrain types as well. We've got field, forest, and plain. But more on those in the terrain modifiers section of this video at the end. For now, what we're thinking about is capacity. When a hex is divided into 3 areas like this, each area has a capacity of 4. That means it can hold 4 bases. In this case, our area is now at capacity. It might not seem like much because we've only got 4 people in there. But it doesn't matter whether your base is this big or this big. It can only hold 4 bases. A half hex area like this one can hold 6 bases. And once again, it doesn't matter whether your little base is like this or a big base like this. We can still only hold 6 total. Up here, we've got a half hex area, but there's a tree in it. The tree has a size of 1, which means that 1 capacity in this area is already taken up, and it can only hold 5 bases. This big house here is size 2, which means it takes up a capacity of 2. So this area only has space for 4 bases. Small terrain pretty much all has a capacity occupancy of 1. Trees and bushes have a capacity occupancy of 1 as well. Large terrain has a capacity occupancy of 2. This pretty much only includes the large house and the church. But you may have more large terrain if you have any of the expansions. And up here we've got an entire terrain hex, which has a capacity of 8. But it should be noted that an area can only contain allies. An area will never contain 2 opposing factions. Areas are adjacent if they have 1 touching border. So for example, our area here is adjacent to this area, this area, this area, and this area. Buildings are a little bit special. Buildings are only adjacent to the area that they're in. Units can enter a building, and when you enter a building, it will tell you the capacity of that building. In this case, the building has a capacity of 4, so it can hold 4 units. When units enter a building, they must come from the adjacent area. Unlike regular areas, buildings are actually able to hold units of both factions, which means that if the French halberdiers are in this large house, then the English halberdiers can come in and fight them. This is not possible in any other area. Buildings can take damage, and when they take a number of damage tokens equal to their total capacity, they are destroyed. The tile is flipped over to its rubble side. Rubble always has a capacity of 1, rather than 2. Units inside buildings get bonuses. More on that in the terrain modifier section of this video, but units in rubble do not get those bonuses. Rubble does not count as a terrain element. Any units in the building, when it is turned to rubble, are hit by 1 red die, which they can defend against. In this case, we've got a kill result. Our halberdiers have a defense of 1 red die and 1 white die. Unfortunately, we haven't rolled a defense result, so the halberdiers are removed from the board. Each unit will roll separately for damage. Any elements that fit between hexes, such as stakes and walls, do not have a capacity because they're not placed in an area. Barricades are placed in areas, and therefore they have a capacity of 1. More on barricades in the engineer skills section of this video. Now we're moving on to actions and orders, which is the vast majority of this rules video. This is what happens in the first phase of a player's turn. So when we get to the first player turn, we will have 2 phases, orders phase and reserve phase. This is the orders phase. There are 4 types of actions that you can do in the orders phase, some of which require an order in order to take, and others do not. You've got unit actions, which relate to all of the things with bases. You've got character bonus actions, which are bonus things that individual characters can do, which units typically can't. You've got skill actions, which typically require an order to use. And you've got player actions, which you carry out as a player and don't require orders. An order is typically issued to a single area, and all of the units in that area get to do one thing, unless they're a character, in which case they can do a few special things. There are 4 unit actions, 3 which require an order, and 1 which does not. The 3 unit actions that require an order are move, attack, and wait. The bonus unit action that does not require an order is recruit a civilian. There are 4 bonus character actions, which are discuss, command, use equipment, and upgrade the character. These bonus actions can only be used when the character is activated by an order, but do not cost the action of that order, so they can be used before or after their normal unit action. This means that a character may be upgraded and discuss, or use a piece of equipment. This means a character may be upgraded and discuss and use a piece of equipment all before they move or attack. There are 6 skill actions. These include haste, jump, charge, prayer, heal, and engineer. All of them require an order to use, and charge can only be used with a special charge order. More on these in the skills section. Finally, there are 2 player actions. Play a legendary card by paying its cost. It may have a specific trigger window that you need to pay attention to. And use an intrigue ability from these intrigue cards. You'll have to pay a cost, and they may have a specific trigger window that you have to pay attention to. There are 4 types of orders available to you. A standard order, a charge order, a reactivate order, and an interrupt order. The different order types are stored in the different order sections on your player board. The standard order is used to activate one area on the board. The charge order is used specifically for the charge ability, which we'll talk a bit more about in the skills action section of the video. The reactivation order is used to reactivate an area that's already been activated, which will make more sense in just a moment. And the interrupt order can be used to interrupt your opponent's turn for you to take a quick activation. More on that in just a minute. Orders can always be downgraded, so you can always use one of the special orders as a regular gray order. Here are some basic rules to keep in mind when using an order to activate an area. When you place an order onto the board, you place it into a specific area to activate that area. All of the units in that area can then take an action. Once an area contains an order flag, it cannot contain another one unless it just so happens to be one of these reactivation orders. When an order is placed, all of the units in that area get to take a normal action. In addition, they can do any bonus actions applicable. Characters have a lot more bonus actions available to them than regular units. The only bonus action available to regular units is recruit a civilian. Once an area has been activated, we plan all of the actions we intend to take in that area. In this case, let's say we're going to move the halberdiers into here, and we're going to attack the English halberdiers with the Sergeant at Arms and Joan of Arc. Each unit can take different actions as you please, but you don't resolve the actions until you've planned them all. Furthermore, you can only make one single attack into an area per activation, which means that if we want to attack the English halberdiers, we need to plan all of that in advance. Some cards and abilities may allow you to activate different units across the board or may move units around. It should be noted that Each unit can only take one action per activation. Now that we've planned this out, our halberdiers will move in here and we'll resolve this fight. After the fight, we've wound up with a scenario like this. Remember, because there's already an order in here, Joan of Arc cannot be activated again this turn. Interrupt flags are used on your opponent's turn. And so, whenever your opponent places and resolves an order, they must ask you, if you have an available interrupt, would you like to use your interrupt? They cannot deliberately move straight on to the next order without checking to see if you want to use your interrupt. So now we're going to talk about the move action. In order to move, you need to activate the area with a unit in it, and then that move will cost the unit its activation. So they can move or attack, because both cost an activation, they can't do both. Unless you have the charge special rule, but more on that later. When a unit moves, it can move into any free adjacent area. Areas are adjacent when they share one complete border with the area that you're in. So in this case, our halberdiers could move in here, or into here, or into here, but not into this area because it contains the English halberdiers. If we want to go in there, we're going to have to attack them. All units can only move one space per move action. The exception is with charge, skill action, or haste skill action, or jump skill action, all of which are covered in the skill action section of this video. Otherwise, it's only one area. It should be noted that it is possible for us to have characters with opposing factions in the same army, and that can't enter the same space together. But more on that very particular situation when we get to upgrading a character. There are also special rules for flying units, which are covered later, and special rules for terrain that are covered in the terrain modifiers section later as well. Our halberdiers can only move into this building if they're in the same area as the building. In order to move into the building, we just remove it from the board and put them into the building interior space. So now that we've covered movement, let's move on to attack. There are two types of attack in the game, melee and shooting. We'll look at melee attacks first. So the French decide to activate this area here, and they move all of their units into an attack against the English in this area here. When you perform a melee attack, you pool all of your units into a single resource. So attacking with more units is better. Your enemy will also pool all of their defense for that area into one pool. In this case, the English are being attacked by level 1 Joan of Arc, who has 1 white attack die. Additionally, there's also this unit of foot knights, who have 2 red attacks, and this unit of halberdiers, who have 1 white attack, plus 1 when attacking against infantry. Well, the English have only got infantry in here. They've got a unit of sergeant of arms, who are infantry, and their own unit of halberdiers, who are also infantry. So we'll create a pool of 3 white dice and 2 red dice. At this point, we would also pay attention to whether or not any of these dice need to be separated. But because our units don't have any special abilities that are worth noting at this moment, we don't have to worry about that. So we roll the pool of dice. So it looks like, very conveniently, we've got 1 kill result, 1 disrupt result, 1 push result, 1 defend result, and 1 blank result. These constitute all of the different results you'll see on these dice. All of the 4 colored dice have the same results on them, the distribution is just different. Some are better at certain things than others. For example, the red dice are the best at killing and have the most kill faces on them. The black dice are the best at defending and have the most shields on them. Everything else is somewhere in the middle. So now that our French have rolled their attack, we're going to check the English defense. The English have 1 halberdier unit who have a red and white defend die, and a sergeant at arms who have 1 red defend die. Now it should be noted they both also have this keyword retaliation. So we roll their defense, and now we've got a disrupt, a kill, and a shield. Now that we've successfully rolled both pools, the attacker will apply any special abilities they have to their pool of dice. But they don't have any. The English bowmen, for example, would have to roll their dice separately, because they have a special attacking rule on their yellow dice, which only applies to the bowman's yellow dice. At this time, we would apply this special rule. Because we don't have any special rules, we'll just leave the pool as is. The defender would then also apply their special rules and powers now. An example of this might be the Foot Knight's special skill here to cancel one push when defending. But there are no Foot Knights on the English side, and the Sergeant-at-Arms and Halberdiers don't have any defensive abilities. So again, we're not modifying any dice pools. And now we'll remove any blank results from the combat. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take any shields that were rolled in defense and use these to cancel the attack results. We're going to cancel these results in order of severity. Kill is the worst, so we'll cancel those first. Disrupt is the second worst, so we'll cancel that next. And push is the least bad, so we'll cancel it last. We don't need to cancel shields because typically they don't have an effect. So this defense die will cancel out this kill result. Now the defender will assign the remaining results to their units. So in this case we'll decide to disrupt the Halberdiers, and they're removed from the board. More on what happens to them later. We'll assign the push result to the Sergeant-at-Arms. Now that we've assigned all the results, the attacker will choose the effects of the push. The attacker can select any legitimate area adjacent to the Sergeant-at-Arms for them to be pushed into. Obviously, they cannot go into areas occupied by their enemies, and they cannot be pushed into areas that are at capacity. The attacker can choose different areas for each unit that suffers a push. In this case, we'll send the Sergeant-at-Arms back here into this area. Something special would happen at this point because of this retaliation keyword on the English forces side, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. But let's pretend for a minute that the retaliation keyword was not present. The conflict is resolved, and the French can choose to do a follow-up action. This is because the area they're attacking is completely empty. If they had not removed all the English units, then they would stay in their area and the combat would be resolved. But because all of the English have been removed from the area, the French can follow up with as many of their units into this area as they like. This could be all of them, or just a selection. With that follow-up, this combat is now resolved. But there's a few little pointers I want to cover before we move on. Results are assigned in the order of their severity. So let's just say that the French were under attack this time, and they had suffered a kill, 2 disrupts, and 2 pushes. Now they decide to assign the kill to Joan of Arc. More on why that is in a moment. They'll give the 2 disrupts to these remaining 2 units here. Now they've got to assign the 2 pushes, but they must assign 1 push to Joan of Arc because after you've assigned a single die to a unit, it cannot have another die. That's because these 2 units will be removed from the board. Every unit only has 1 wound unless they're a character with multiple wounds indicated. And because you assign dice in order of severity, pushes are always assigned last, so they cannot be assigned to a unit with a die already assigned to it. We'll put 1 push down on Joan of Arc. This final push is removed because a unit cannot have more than 1 push assigned to it. These 2 units are removed from the board because they are disrupted. Joan of Arc has been assigned a kill, but because she has more than 1 wound, she takes a wound token and places it on her character sheet. If she were to take a second wound token, then she would move to either the graveyard or the disrupted infirmary. More on those in just a second when we get to casualties. So before we resolved this conflict earlier, you'll remember that we had this retaliate keyword. The English had rolled a kill and a disrupt result as part of their defense roll. Retaliate allows you to assign these to the attacker, causing damage to them directly. Now the attacker had rolled a shield as part of their attack roll. However, it doesn't help. You cannot defend against retaliate rolls. So in this case, the French would have to assign these two results to their army and then resolve them as normal. When resolving kills and disrupts, we need to come back to our battle board. You'll see here on the battle board this deadly skull and a disrupt symbol that matches our disrupt here in the middle, as well as a little hourglass down here. This is the sort of disrupt infirmary section here. Any units removed from the board with a kill result are placed up here in the dead section of the board. These units have been removed from the game and cannot come back. Any units removed from the board by a disrupt result will go here into the disrupt infirmary and may yet return to the game. When a character receives wounds equal to or greater than the wounds on their character sheet, they are also removed from the board. If they were removed by a disrupt symbol, then they go to the disrupt infirmary. But if their final wound was dealt with a kill, they'll go up here, and they cannot come back. They're dead for good. A lot of scenarios will offer rewards for killing units, i.e. moving them up here to the dead section of the battle board. When you remove a unit from the board with the kill symbol, that reward is attained. Furthermore, when any opposing units move from this infirmary up here into the kill section, you will also gain that reward. If you remember, our camp phase begins with a casualty phase. And in the casualty phase, what we're going to do is we're going to roll this fate die to find out what happens to any of the units sent to the disrupt infirmary. The fate die has 4 sides. The rally side, and if you roll the rally side, the unit is moved from the disrupt infirmary back to its rally spot on the board. So the English would return here to their rally point. Some characters also have the rally special ability and can act as rally points in addition to your regular rally point. Thus you can choose which one you want to use. If a hero ever rallies, then they rally with the number of wound tokens that were on their card when they were sent to the infirmary. This means they almost always rally with just 1 wound remaining. If you roll the timed rally symbol, you'll move down here. This means in the next casualties phase, so a turn later, you'll return to your rally point. So you do get to rally, but you have to wait a turn first. If you roll the disrupt symbol on the fate die, you just stay in the infirmary and roll again next time. And finally, if you roll the kill symbol, unfortunately you're out of luck and you have to move up here to the kill area, and your opponent will gain any of the bonuses described by this scenario for killing a unit. Typically this involves XP, but could involve other elements too. Each player starts the game with 1 reroll token. You can use this immediately after rolling any pool of dice. This could be an attack, it could be a defense, it could even be the fate die. But once it's gone, and they're very hard to come by. Ranged attacks work a bit differently to melee attacks, but they're resolved in much the same way. When you activate an area containing a ranged unit, you have to check their range and also their type of ranged attack. In this case, we've got a ranged 2 arcing attack. The other kind of ranged attack is a direct attack, like this. This is a range 1 direct attack. Let's talk a little bit about the differences. The range is measured in hexes. So in this case, the bowmen have a range of 2 hexes. 1, 2. Now, because it's measured in hexes, we can attack into this area. If the halberdiers and foot soldiers were in different areas, we'd have to choose one area to attack. So we don't attack the entire hex, but we can choose any area in the hex to attack. Because it's an arcing shot, we don't have to worry about line of sight at all. So, in this case, we would elect for the bowmen to shoot into here. We would roll a regular attack, and they would roll a regular defense. It should be noted that when you're resolving a ranged attack, you never resolve retaliation. Conversely, the Genoese crossbowmen have a direct attack, which means they have to shoot straight forward instead of arcing over things. So, if our Genoese crossbowmen are here, and they're activated, they cannot hit the archers here because their line of sight is blocked by this house. Line of sight can also be blocked by a forest. So for example here, if we activated them, they could not shoot the bowmen here because they cannot see through the forest. It should also be noted that the Genoese crossbowmen's line of sight is blocked by the building, but they can still attack into the space, which means although they can't hit the foot soldiers, they can hit the halberdiers. For full details on the terrain that blocks line of sight for direct attacks, check the terrain modifiers section of this video. This also covers any additional modifiers that terrain might have on ranged attacks, as well as all other terrain modifiers. If a ranged unit is in a building, they can only shoot into the area directly adjacent to the building. Additionally, any ranged units in the area adjacent to a building can shoot into it. The final normal action that you can use when you take a normal order is wait, and that's just do nothing. So don't move, don't attack. And the last thing to talk about is, of course, the recruit a civilian bonus action. So here we've got our merchant girl civilian. We'll put her down here. When a unit activates in an area with a civilian, they can recruit that civilian. The faction owner will take the civilian card to show that the civilian now belongs to them. So long as the civilian remains in a space with that faction's unit, the civilian will remain on that faction's side. But if the faction ever leaves, and the civilian is left alone, the owner loses the card and they become neutral again. Because you can take a bonus action before or after your normal action, you can also move into an area with a civilian and then immediately recruit them by taking the card. A lot of civilians have abilities like the merchant girl here, which can be used once per turn. In order to use this ability, you must activate this civilian. So you need to put an order down into the space where they're located with your troops. If a civilian is ever hit by an attack, whether it's kill or disrupt, they always go to the graveyard. They never go to the disrupt infirmary. So that's it for our normal actions as part of our regular order. And what we're going to do now is talk about our character bonus actions. These are bonus actions that can be taken by a character when they are activated. And there are 4 of them, and the character can do as many of those 4 as applicable, but they can only do each one once. So the first one is the command action, and this is the most complex by far. This is a way to activate units in addition to the units activated by your order. Let's take a look at an example. The command action can be found detailed down here on the bottom of a character card, and consists of 2 parts. The first part in white is called the range, and the second part in black is the number of units that can be commanded. The range is just like a ranged attack in that it's done by hexes. So, in this case, Joan of Arc has a range of 1, which means she can command units up to 1 hex away. In this case, we don't have any units 1 hex away. We've only got a unit here in this area, and a unit here in Joan of Arc's area. Now, it's important to note, no matter what range you have, you cannot use command on units in your own area. So in this case, Joan of Arc could only command this unit of foot soldiers here. She's only able to command 1 unit, so she can order these foot soldiers to do something. And this would trigger a normal activation for them. So they could move, they could attack, so they could move in here, they could even move in here. Now, we would have an activation order in here to activate Joan of Arc, and if she moves them in here, that's their activation. They don't get to do another action again. So if Joan of Arc and the halberdiers want to attack in here, they cannot bring the foot soldiers with them because they were not in the area when the order flag was placed. Level 2 Joan of Arc has a slightly better command order, which allows her to take up to 2 hexes away and command 2 units. In this scenario, we put the order down here, and then level 2 Joan of Arc can issue an order to this unit here, who could attack these English sergeant-at-arms. We would then resolve this entire attack before moving on to the second command order, which could be issued to this unit here, and because this is now sort of a separate activation, they could also attack into this space if the sergeant-at-arms had survived. Then this would be resolved, and whatever the outcome, we would then move back to Joan of Arc for her normal activation. A slightly more unusual notation is this A here. This means an adjacent area. So that might include areas on other hexes, but it doesn't include the entire hex. For example, if Joan of Arc had this range, she could command this unit here, because they are adjacent even though they're not within the same hex. In this example here, we activate the square with Joan of Arc level 2 and also Jean de Denois. Joan of Arc has a 2-2 command ability. Jean de Denois has a command ability of 1-2. Both can reach this space with the Genoese crossbowmen, but if Joan of Arc were to use her command ability first, she would select 2 of these units who could then shoot into the English infantry here. Jean can also reach them, and he can activate 2 units. However, these 2 have already activated and attacked, so they cannot be activated again because this is a single order. He would have to pick 2 separate units. So he could pick this crossbowman unit and do an attack into this space with it. And then he could pick these halberdiers and maybe do a move action with them or something else. If we had a reactivation, we could then go in here and they could use their command ability to do the same thing again or move the halberdiers again. Note that because this is a bonus action, it can be taken before or after Joan of Arc and Jean do their regular attacks. So we can fire all of the crossbowmen, and then if we don't get the desired result, we might decide to attack into this space or do something else entirely. You cannot use a command action to command another character. Command actions can only be used to activate units. The only exception to this is the mercenary special ability. Part of the mercenary special ability means that you can be activated by a command action from another character. The last thing to talk about with the command action is that some command actions have this little faction banner above them. This means that the command action can only be used on units that are of that faction. So for example, the priest here cannot command the sergeant at arms because they are not holy. He could command level 2 Jean de Denois, who is holy, but not the unholy side. Similarly, he couldn't command unholy Joan of Arc, but he could command holy Joan of Arc. So that just about covers it for the command action. So let's talk about upgrading our character. Over the course of the game, you will acquire experience points. Typically, these are acquired by destroying enemy units. That means moving them to the graveyard, not just disrupting them. But you can acquire experience points in other ways. Intrigue points are much harder to come by, and so every intrigue point you have can also be spent as an experience point. You can spend experience points to upgrade a character. The cost is here under the star. So if we want to upgrade this level 1 Joan of Arc to level 2 Joan of Arc, we have to pay 2 experience points. Then we flip the card over to the level 2 side. But this doesn't have one. If it did, then we'd live with that. But if it doesn't, that means there's a special level 2 card, and that's because this is double-sided, and you see, we have an unholy and holy side. This is an important distinction. In addition to having completely different abilities, probably, there is also the important distinction that they now have a specific faction. This may have no real relevance, or it may be really important. For example, unholy Joan of Arc cannot enter the same area as holy Jean de Denois, because they are now on opposing factions, even though they're both on the same French team. Furthermore, if they were in the same space when Joan of Arc was upgraded, she couldn't upgrade to the unholy side. She would have to go to the holy side. If Joan of Arc has taken a wound when she's upgraded, she'll still have the wound when she's level 2. You want to think carefully about when you're going to upgrade a character. It is a bonus action, which means you can do it for free when the character is activated. But once you've upgraded a character, you must start paying its upkeep in the council phase. If you remember, upkeep is the last part of the council phase at the beginning of the round. And for every level 2 character you have on your side, you must discard 1 experience point. If you can't discard it, then the character is de-leveled to level 1. Now, this might not be a big deal, but if your level 2 character has 2 wounds on it, and then de-levels to level 1, and those wounds would kill it, the character is killed and moved to the disrupted zone. Another free character action you can do is discussion. And discussion involves talking to civilians. You can do a discussion when you see the talkie bubble on the civilian card. Joan of Arc's space is activated, and she decides to move in here. As free action, she can recruit this civilian, and as another free action, she can talk to them. When you talk to a civilian, you take the 4 discussion cards marked with 1 star. You then give these a shuffle and draw the bottom card. This has 4 questions on it, and you can pick one of the questions to ask the civilian. Note that you can only pick these marked questions if you have the correct faction. Some characters have a special keyword called charismatic, which allows them to pick anything they want, whether or not their faction matches. Some questions are also in red like this. Now, after you ask a question, you'll pass this card over to your opponent, who will read the answer from the back of the card. The answer may result in you getting a reward, or maybe rolling a die, and if it doesn't go in your favor, having to take a penalty. The questions in red are higher risk, therefore they have better rewards, but also more severe penalties. Once you've picked your question, you'll hand this over to your opponent, who will then flip it over and read the corresponding answer on the back. They won't show this to you because you might have to test a die roll, and based on the result of the die roll, you might have a different outcome. Some of those outcomes might refer you to asking a level 2 question, in which case you'd go over to the level 2 cards, randomize them, and go again. A character can only do 1 discussion action per turn. Furthermore, after a discussion action is resolved with a specific civilian, that civilian is removed from the game, regardless of the outcome of the discussion. Take the card, take the model, gone. Discussions often result in you gaining experience points or legendary points or intrigue tokens, or, if you're very lucky, equipment cards. So let's talk about using equipment cards. There are 2 decks of equipment cards, a yellow deck and a blue deck. The yellow deck is mythical cards, and they're typically very powerful and cool. The blue deck is called tactical cards, and they're kind of like run-of-the-mill equipment that you might find anywhere. If a character resolves a conversation with a civilian and they gain an equipment card, you'll probably be instructed to draw the top card of the deck. You then assign it to the character that was in the discussion. Characters can freely transfer equipment cards between characters in their area. So in this case, if we wanted, we could give the exceptional dagger without penalty to Jean de Denois. A character can only have a maximum of 2 equipment cards at any given time, but they can, if they want, if they were to gain a third, immediately discard one of the ones they already have in order to take it. Furthermore, they could just pass it off to another character in their area for free in order to save it that way. If a character is removed from the board and sent to the graveyard, they're dead and all their equipment is lost. But if they go to the disrupted infirmary, they may come back so they can keep their equipment until such time as they go to the graveyard. So now what we're going to talk about are skill actions. Skills are keywords that are found on cards that have additional effects or modify the rules of the game in some way. There are quite a lot of skills in the game. They're all detailed in the back of the rulebook as well as on the player aid. So I'm not going to cover them all here, but there are 6 fairly basic, pretty key ones that I will talk about because they're laid out in the rulebook under skill actions. And the reason for that is because these 6 require an order activation in order to use them. The rest are all passive in some way or work in some special way. The very first skill action we're going to talk about is charge, because that's the most fundamental and it's going to come up the most often. There are a few things you need to know about charge. You can only do it if you have the charge keyword on your card. It works slightly differently for infantry and cavalry, and if you want to use it, you need to have a special order activation. So let's look at that. The first thing you need to use charge is this charge order. If you don't have it, you can't use it. Now, here we've got some French cavalry and some French foot soldiers. And we're going to put down the charge order here. Now, the French cavalry have the charge keyword, so they can charge. The foot knights don't, so they can't. As far as the foot knights are concerned, this charge order is just a regular gray order. The cavalry, however, can do a charge. A charge allows them to move up to 2 areas and attack. So we could go 1, 2, or we could go 1 and attack into here. Or if the English were hiding up here in the ruins, we could go 1, 2 into here and then attack into that space. We know, of course, that they're cavalry because of the horse symbol in their card here. Some infantry also have charge as a keyword, and an infantry charge works exactly the same way as a cavalry charge, except they can only move one space and then attack, and not two. The next skill action we'll look at is Haste. Haste just allows you to move more than one area. So for example, if Beausissot was to activate, he would be able to move one area and then another area. Angels have this special ability, Jump. That's basically the same as Haste, except you can ignore enemies in the way. So for example, we could go 1, 2. You can also ignore obstacles in the way and other things that affect movement. Essentially, you disappear from the board and reappear 2 areas adjacent. You'll note that the Angel is also a flying unit, but we'll look at flying later. The next keyword here is Heal, and when you use Heal, you can remove a wound from yourself or any character that's in your area. Joan of Arc also has the Prayer keyword. And when you use Prayer, you can gain either a legendary point or an experience point. The final skill action we've got is Engineer, and this is a bit of a special one. And when you use an Engineer action, you can do one of 2 things. You can either set a fire and then take immediately a free move, or if you're in an area with a fire, you can remove it. Fire doesn't do anything until the camp phase, in which case it is resolved, and we looked at that in the camp phase at the beginning of this video. The other thing you can do as an engineer is place a barricade. Barricades can only be placed in forest areas with trees, in village areas with buildings, or inside buildings. Each area can only hold 1 barricade. When you're being attacked, barricades give you 1 extra white die in defense. And furthermore, if you're pushed or retreat or killed, they prevent the unit from following up into the space. If an enemy moves into an area with a barricade you placed, the barricade is removed from the board. However, if the enemy attacking you happens to be an engineer themselves, then they can follow up and remove the barricade and can ignore the anti-follow-up rule. And so those are the skill actions. Now that we've covered those, we're ready to move on to the player actions, of which there are 2. Player actions are play a legendary card or use an Intrigue ability. Note that none of these cost orders. Player actions cost legendary points and Intrigue points, not orders. Legendary cards come in 2 types. Tactical, which are typically used for the more historically accurate scenarios, and mythical, which are typically used for the scenarios that involve mythical creatures and fantastical things. Playing a legendary card is easy. You can have as many as you want in your hand. In order to play one, you must pay legendary points equal to the cost on the bottom of the card. Some cards can be played at any point on your turn, and others have special triggering events. For example, this one's triggered when defending. This one's triggered at any time. Note that unless the triggering window specifies that it can be played on your opponent's turn, it is always played on your turn. The second player action is an Intrigue. Each scenario has a specific Intrigue card associated with it that will be given to the player during setup. This has a series of abilities on them that can be triggered on your turn. If there's no specific triggering window, then it can be triggered at any time. For example, this one says when defending, and this one says if this character has been activated. But this one says place a character on the board, so this can be done at any time. When you want to trigger the ability, you take the appropriate number of Intrigue points and put them onto the card. Once an ability has been used, it cannot be used again unless the text on the card indicates it can be used more than once. Because Intrigue points are quite hard to come by and quite valuable for this purpose, they can be traded at any time on your turn for either an experience point or a legendary point. And so with that, we've actually covered all of the orders and actions that you can do on a given turn. Once you've used up all of the orders you wish to use, you move on to the reserve phase and resolve that, and then it's time for the next players to have a turn or to move on to the camp phase. But before we close out this video, we need to talk about a few more things. The first thing we have to talk about is the terrain modifiers that I kept alluding to, because all of the terrain is different and all of it has a slight effect. So let's have a look at the terrain now. So here we've got plains and fields. Plains just look like grassland, and fields have the wheat in them. Now, these are basically completely unimpacting. The only special rule is that if cavalry perform a charge that takes them over only plains and fields, then they can re-roll 1 die as part of their attack. Village tiles without buildings have no specific effect. Here, we've got swamps. When you're being attacked in a swamp, after you've rolled for defense, you automatically lose one of your shields. So, it's hard to defend in the swamp. Furthermore, you cannot charge into a swamp, and you cannot charge out of a swamp either. You can only move in and out or attack in and out. We've also got here rocks and hills. And when you're defending in the rocks or the hills, you can do an automatic mini retaliate. Remember the retaliate we looked at in the combat section of this video? Well, when you are defending in the hills or the rocks, you can take one of your results from your defense roll and retaliate with it. So unlike a regular retaliate that allows you to do it with all of your aggressive results, these terrain types let you choose one and apply it. Furthermore, if you remember our crossbowmen, their line of sight is blocked by hills and rocks, so they cannot shoot through them to units on the other side. Finally, any units that are on the hills and the rocks, when firing, gain 1 additional hex of range. Because they're high up, they can shoot further. Not very useful for these crossbowmen here, though, who have their line of sight blocked by these 2 adjacent areas. Forests with trees allow the units inside to re-roll 1 die when they're defending. They also cannot be shot through by units with direct ranged attacks, but they can be shot into. So, for example, our crossbowmen here could shoot these English halberdiers here, but could not shoot them in this space here. Villages with buildings are basically the exact same. When shooting into a village space with a building, they can reroll 1 defense dice. This also goes for a melee attack into this space as well. You can reroll 1 defense die. Furthermore, if the halberdiers were here, then the crossbowmen could not shoot them because the building blocks line of sight. Building interiors can only be attacked by units in the adjacent area. These units can enter the building and attack you, but if they attack from the adjacent area into the building, then the defenders get 1 additional black die. As we looked at in the engineer section of the skill action, a barricade in your area gives you 1 additional white die in defense, and it prevents follow-up. Enemies moving into the area will remove it. These stakes are placed by bowmen and work the exact same way as barricades, except that enemies do not remove them unless they move over them. So in this case, the cavalry charge, if it killed the bowman, then it would prevent the follow-up, but the cavalry could move in later, and when they cross the stakes, those stakes are removed. Note that the stakes, while they would prevent follow-up of the cavalry, do not add to the defense of any units other than the bowmen. So in this case, the halberdiers would not get the additional white die. Finally, we've got the wall here, and the wall prevents defenders from being pushed out of the space they're in, and furthermore, attackers, if they do kill the defenders, cannot follow up. And so that's it for the core rules of Joan of Arc. You should now know enough to play the game and get through most of the scenarios in the core set book. There's just a few advanced rules that I will cover now, but you only need to watch this section if you're going to use them specifically in your scenario. They are rules for war machines, rules for flying units, and rules for gigantic units. After I've been over those, the video will be over, and you can go and enjoy your games of Joan of Arc, Time of Legends. Or is it Time of Legends, Joan of Arc? Anyway, I hope this video has been informative if you're leaving us now. If you're interested in seeing war machines, let's get on with it. Here we've got an example of a culverin. And the culverin is a ranged 2-hex direct attack. You can tell it's a war machine because this little symbol here. And the most important thing to note really about war machines is that, well, for a start, when they're deployed with 2 crew. And the base counts as 1 occupancy, just like a regular base, but it operates slightly differently. First, a culverin or a war machine can only move 1 area per turn. Doesn't matter whether there's something that allows them to move more than 1, some special rule, or perhaps there's a character with a command. 1 space per turn. Second thing is the crew kind of act like additional wounds. So at the time of making this video, there's a rule describing the 2 artillerymen that are deployed with the culverin here. It says that whenever the culverin is dealt a disrupt or a kill result, these are applied to the crewmen on the culverin, and they are moved to the appropriate area of the battle board. This means that if they are disrupted, they can return to the battlefield. Furthermore, if they do not return to their normal rally point, but they are in fact attached directly back to the war machine. Whether this is expanded upon in Wave 2 is unclear, as there is no specific card for the crew managing the culverin. There is only a card for the culverin. This also goes for the bombard, the other war machine in this box. But hopefully we'll see some clarifications on this when Wave 2 arrives. The culverin can only attack units, but has this special targeting ability that allows it to target specific units. The bombard, the other war machine, can attack buildings and can do damage to buildings, which is tracked with these damage tokens. For rules on how buildings are destroyed, see the earlier rundown at the beginning of the rules video in the terrain section. If you want to play with flying units, you'll need these sky boards. Note that unlike the ground boards, these aren't double-sided because they are often randomized. If the scenario tells you how to set it up, then just follow the instructions for the scenario. If it doesn't, then randomly take 2 of the tiles and put them face down next to each other like this. Then what you're going to do is add another tile for every gigantic creature with flying in the game. So if you've got 1, we'll add a tile here. If you've got 2, another one goes here. If you've got 3, a third here. I don't know how you're going to have this many. There isn't this many in Wave 1, but the rules tell you how to put out up to 5 extra flying tiles. But let's say we're just playing with 1 extra gigantic creature, so we'll put out 3 sky tiles. The remaining tiles, if you've got any, I'll return to the box. Once the tiles have been placed, and if you're doing this as part of the setup, this is the last thing you'll do after you've set up the ground board and everyone's got their bits and pieces for the scenario. Then you'll flip over the sky tiles, and we can take a look at these in a bit more detail. So you'll see that the sky tiles are divided up into areas just like the ground tiles. Here we've got 2 8 capacity areas, and here we've got 2 6 capacity areas. Adjacency is just the same, so this one is adjacent to these 2, and this is adjacent just to that one. Sky tiles are adjacent to all ground areas, with the exception of building interiors, which means that you could move from any of these sky areas to any area on the ground. When a flying unit moves from a ground area to a sky area, or from a sky area to a ground area, it can only do that once per turn. So you could not activate it, move it to the ground, activate it again, move it back to the sky, and so on and so forth. Just once per turn it can leave the sky or enter the sky, not both. When moving around in the sky, this is handled exactly the same way as moving around on the ground. If you're pushed during a combat in the sky with an enemy, you will be pushed to another area in the sky. Similarly, if you're pushed on the ground, then you'll stay on the ground. You wouldn't be pushed into the sky. Now, it should be noted that combat in the sky works exactly the same way as combat and ground in terms of melee and shooting, but additionally, any unit on the ground with a range of 1 or greater can shoot at any area in the sky. And any unit in the sky with a range of 1 or greater can shoot at any unit on the ground. If you are a melee flying unit and you want to attack units on the ground, you must first land on the ground adjacent to that unit and attack into the space as normal. You cannot land in the area they are in because, of course, you cannot move into an area with an enemy faction. Melee combat in the sky works exactly the same way as melee combat on the ground. If you're a flying character with a command action, then so long as the command action has a range of 1 or more, you can command to any area on the ground. The sky also has terrain, just like the ground. Here we've got some clouds, and here we've got some clouds and a rainbow. These two areas are terrain-free. Clouds add 1 black die to defense when you're defending against shooting. This makes clouds a great place for flying ranged units to hide from ranged ground units and snipe them. And rainbows add 1 black die to attack when you're attacking areas adjacent to this one. So now that we've talked about flying units, let's talk about the last thing, the gigantic units. Do not confuse a gigantic unit with a big unit. Some units are just big, and big units take up a capacity of 3 in their space, but otherwise operate like regular units. Gigantic units operate entirely differently. For a start, they occupy entire hexes, and they don't care about areas. We can tell gigantic units because they'll have these special additional boards. Obviously, we've got a faction here and a name. Then we've got a cost to activate the unit and its type. Also, if they have the ability to make a command action, there'll be a command option down here. So the beast is a flying unit, which you can tell from these mammoth great wings, which means that it can move into the sky and move around on the ground. To activate it on the ground costs 1 activation token, and to move it around in the sky costs 2, so it's a bit more expensive. It's got 14 hit points in total, and over here are its basic stats. So it's got a melee attack of 3 red dice, it's got a direct ranged attack, range 2, that has 1 red die per unit in the targeted area. And then it's got this over here, which is called a gigantic attack. And in this case, it gets 1 purple die per area in the targeted hex. And these purple die, which we'll be talking about in a minute, are pretty special. Then it's got a defense value, and you can see here it's got 2 shields. The defense value of these gigantic creatures is always applied automatically, so it won't ever roll for defense, it will always just count as having 2 shields. Over here we've got its keywords, so it's got Terror 2, which means you need to roll dice in order to be able to attack it, and it's fireproof, which means you can't hurt it with fire. Then it's got a whole bunch of special rules here that apply to it as well. If it is in the sky, and you have to spend 2 orders to activate it, then you just put 1 down and discard the excess. Gigantic creatures can only move into hexes that don't contain any units, buildings, or terrain elements. But don't worry, because they can destroy all of these things with their gigantic attacks. When a giant creature does a gigantic attack, they'll roll a number of purple dice equal to the number of areas in the hex. So if we were to attack into this hex here, we would roll 2 purple dice. After you roll the dice, you assign each dice to one of the areas in the target hex. Then that die has an effect on that whole area. The dice have 4 symbols on them. You've got your standard kill symbol, you've got a disrupt symbol, you've got a push symbol, and you've got this special trample symbol. Now, if you roll the kill symbol and apply it to an area, then you multiply it by the number of units in that area, and they have to defend. So in this case, we would roll defense for these 2 units against 2 kill results. The same goes for a disrupt result. So we just have to roll defense with these 2 units against 2 disrupt results. The same for the push. It'd just be like being hit with 2 push results. Trample is exactly the same as a push result with one exception. You can't roll defense. So if we put a trample down here, these 2 units are going to get pushed. And the beasts can pick where they go, so it might pick over here. If we put down a kill or a disrupt into this area here, then this building will take 1 damage. If it's a terrain element, such as a tree, bush, or rock, then it's just removed. If all elements are removed from the hex, then the beast or other gigantic creature can do a follow-up. Terrifyingly, unlike regular melee attacks, gigantic attacks can be made from the sky. Gigantic creatures are never ever sent to the disrupted infirmary. If you ever exceed their hit points, they are destroyed. And that's it for Joan of Arc Time of Legends. I hope you feel confident now in playing your own games at home with your friends, and that you're excited to get stuck in. But if you want to see it in action, please come back tomorrow, where I will be sitting down and playing through one of the scenarios from the core set with my friend Ollie. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.